Well, we've been in a series called Humble King. Humble King. And it's all about how Jesus was both humble and he was king. And Andrew has preached brilliantly about a different kind of judge and the authority dilemma. And if you missed those messages, I encourage you, take a moment, check them out. They were so incredible. In particular, the different kind of judge really spoke to me. And today, I've been tasked with preaching about how Jesus served. The Bible says very clearly, and Jesus himself says, I came to not be served, but to serve. And so we're going to talk tonight about how we are to serve and why we are to serve others. And I'm going to be reading from the book of Matthew in chapter 20, verses 25 through 28. And if you're taking notes, the title of my message is Saved to Serve. Saved to serve. And I want to set up a little bit about what's happening here in the book of Matthew. You see, up until this point, the disciples have witnessed Jesus do the miraculous. And they were comfortable with calling Jesus king, with calling Jesus Lord, with calling Jesus teacher, but they weren't so comfortable with this idea of Jesus as a servant. You see, at this time, a servant meant the lowest of the low, and it meant that this person who served as a servant or as a slave received no credit, no recognition, no pay for anything they did. Often nameless, they were no way credited for what they were doing. And so Jesus enters onto the scene as the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, devoted, worthy, honored, able, more than able of all the praise and adoration of the people, and yet he tells the people, while I'm king, while I'm Lord, while I'm master, while I'm teacher, I am also servant. So it creates some confusion, creates some bewilderment in the eyes and the minds of the apostles. And so what he does is he gathers them together, and James and John in particular were very confused. And so he explains to them what he means. So picking up in verse 25, it says, Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Let's pray. Well, Jesus, we come before you, God, so grateful, Lord, for the opportunity that we have to gather in this place to worship your name. God, I pray that you would open our minds, open our hearts, open our eyes, that Jesus, we would hear from you and see the opportunities that we have to serve. God, I pray that the words that are of me would fall to the floor and the words that are of you would pierce our hearts. In your name, Jesus, we all pray. Amen. Amen. Well, serving has been learned in a whole new capacity since I've become a mom. I would say I had some ideas of serving, but once I became a mom, I learned a whole new lesson about serving. And I continue to learn that lesson, even this afternoon, learning the lessons about serving my children. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that when my babies were born, they were born 100% dependent upon me. They were born needing me for nutrition, needing me for feeding, needing me for diaper changes, needing me for clothing, needing me for sleep, needing me for shelter. They need me for everything. But the goal of growth and maturation is not that they need me in the same way for the rest of their lives, but the goal is that they grow up. The goal is that they walk, they talk, they begin to do for themselves, and eventually they begin to do for others. The same is true in our maturation as Christians. You see, when we become saved, we are saved in title. We receive the free gift of salvation. We become Christians in title and in status. But there is something that has to happen in order for us to grow up in our faith. And a mark of maturity in a Christian is how we serve others. You see, it would be silly if my 14-year-old kids still acted like infants, right? And yet, so often as believers, we've been on this journey for 14 years, but we still act like infant Christians. The goal is that we continue to develop, that we gain the disciplines that are required in order to do this thing called life as a Christian. And so there's a process that has to be undergone, but there's some things that are working against us because we're all born selfish. My daughter, Adriana, her favorite word right now is mine. Everything she sees, mine, mine, mine. My favorite thing to say back to her is, no, that's mine. She doesn't have to be taught to be selfish. She just is that way. She doesn't have to be taught to want for herself. She just is that way. Now, she's 2, so she has an excuse, but what's ours? We're not walking around that much different. We see things, mine. We see what we want. We ask what's in it for me. And so often we don't serve unless it's very clear how it's going to benefit us. And if we don't see a benefit for us, we don't often do it. And what Jesus is doing is flipping humanity on the head and saying that we can't look at things and say, what's in it for me? Instead of asking ourselves what we can get, we have to consider what we can give. Instead of staring at a situation and say there's too much need there, so we turn a blind eye and walk away, we have to ask, what can I do to help meet the need? I may not be able to solve all of it, but I can solve part of it. And so Jesus flips humanity on its head. And so here's the point that I want us to grasp tonight, is that I have been saved for service and not just for status. I have been saved for service and not just for status. And Jesus lays out 3 expectations in these passages for how we are to live serving others. The first one is know your role. Know your role. Jesus makes it very clear that we are to know what our role is. In verse 25, Jesus calls them together and he says this, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. You know that they do this. You see, the rulers of the land, the rulers of the world rule for their own personal benefit. They lord the authority that they have over other people. But rulers of the Spirit lead for the benefit of others. Rulers who rule out of the Spirit think, how can I help other people? When I was graduating from college, I had quite a bit of undergraduate loans, and my parents were unable to help me pay my way through college, and so I was left on my own trying to figure out, how am I going to pay my way out of all this debt? So I had just graduated and I was exploring different opportunities, and I was trying to figure out the fastest way to pay off the most amount of debt as humanly possible. And so I applied for a number of different opportunities, one of which was Holland America Cruise Lines. And I thought, well, that would be fun. I can travel the world, I can pay off debt. So I'd accepted that job when someone told me about this other opportunity. And they told me about how the Miss America organization will pay off your undergraduate loans if you win the title of a state. And I thought, well, that sounds nice. But I, being very unfamiliar with the Miss America organization, had no idea what to expect. So thinking that, this is just a one-time thing, let's see what happens, showed up and competed, and I ended up winning. I thought in being crowned that I was going to be served. I learned very quickly, the very next day, that I was not crowned to be served, I was crowned to serve. And I spent the very next day and the whole following year traveling every single day without a single day off, learning the value of service, speaking in schools and churches and Rotary clubs and all over the country, talking about child abuse awareness and prevention. You see, I thought I was crowned to be served, but I was actually crowned to serve. Every single one of us have been crowned to care. Crowned to serve. We are all sons and daughters of the Most High King. That means you are crowned to serve other people. But so often, just like me, you receive this title, you receive this status of Christian, and you think, oh, come to me, do for me, serve me, just like I did with my crown, my sash, and my scepter. But that's not what God's intention is. That's not what his plan is. You see, what he does is he gifts you with that title. He gifts you with that opportunity so that you can do with it for others. Not so that you can benefit from it for yourself, but so that you can actually do something with it for other people. It's not for our benefit, but it's actually for the benefit of others. And to do this, it means you actually have to lay aside your personal wants, your personal needs, your personal interests. Everything that you selfishly desire, you get to sacrifice for the sake of other people. One of my favorite quotes is that if serving is beneath you, then leading is beyond you. If serving is beneath you, then leading is beyond you. When Andrew and I met on a blind date in college, I remember very distinctly telling him on our first date, just so you know, I'm not going to marry a pastor. To which he responded, it's a first date. To which I felt like an idiot because here I am talking about marriage on a first date. But I just wanted him to know I'm not going to marry a pastor. Well, following month goes by and Andrew was hired with his very first job in ministry. And I'm excited for him, and he tells me what it is, the church janitor. And I thought, well, I knew I wasn't going to marry a pastor. I'm really not going to marry the church janitor. But what I began to see was my husband in his very first vocational role in ministry is an attitude of servitude unlike any other I'd ever witnessed. I watched him approach cleaning the windows of the church building like it was preaching to 10,000 people. I watched him vacuum the carpets in preparation for the people that were going to be coming that Sunday like it was the most important task that had ever been done. I watched him scrub the toilets that the people would be using that weekend like it was literally the throne of God. I watched him serve so humbly, and I really believe this, that because my husband served so faithfully in those moments of insignificance, that is why God has continued to promote him, why God has continued to gift him with opportunity, why God has continued to entrust him with more, is because he proved that he could be trusted with a little, therefore he can be trustworthy with a lot. I love James 4:10 says that God lifts up the humble. He promotes the humble. He opposes the proud, but he promotes the humble. And I love the example of serving that we have all throughout our church. The people who are faithful again and again and again. People like Ned Trevel who are here tonight serving on the safety team, who Christmas Eve will be here serving, showing his children that yes, Christmas Eve is special. Yes, Christmas Eve is awesome, but so is God's house, and so is serving in God's house. The people like the Bergesons, who he was up here playing the guitar, and his wife every week is holding babies in the nursery. Every single week, they're demonstrating for their daughter what it looks like to prioritize God's house. I could go through hundreds of people who stand on this platform, not one of them paid, who serve in our kids' classrooms, not one of them paid, the very production people that are behind you, not one of them paid, because they desire to serve in God's house and see people reached for the kingdom of God. And our serving isn't with just in these four walls. Our serving has to take place in our home, in our marriages, in our families, in our friendships, in our workplaces, in our schools. What kind of example are we setting? Is it an example that points people to Jesus or makes people rethink Christianity? Is it an example that makes people want to race to the house of God? Or is it an example that makes people doubt whether or not God even exists? What kind of an example are we setting? You see, Jesus knew his role and lived it. We have to as well. The second thing I see here is we have to make the choice. So we have to know our role. We have to make the choice. Verses 26 and 27 says, "Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave." Very rarely do I have any conversations with people who say, "Christina, my entire point of life is to be mediocre. My entire aim of existence is to be so-so. All of us have this innate desire to be great at something at some point in time in our lives. And what Jesus is doing here is he's actually setting us up for success. He's actually giving us the keys to his kingdom. There's an entire section of bookstores devoted to the very two things that Jesus lays out for us so simply. Instead of going and buying every self-help book in the bookstore, people should really just pick up the Bible, because God makes it very clear the two things that we are to do if we want to actually be great in this thing called life. He says, if you want to be great, live as a servant. If you want to be first, live as a slave. It's very simple. The two keys to his kingdom that he lays out are how we are to live as a servant and as a slave. Not racing to the front of the line, not trying to point out what we did, not trying to get the credit for everything that happens at work, not trying to remove the credit from that coworker, not trying to outshine the fellow student in math class. The whole point is to give the credit away, to prop people up all around us, and to serve humanity. And I think of it like a night light. A night light. You see, I think the most important light in your home is your night light. May have not ever thought of this, but I became very aware of this a few weeks ago as my husband and I moved into our house, and I'm still getting familiar with it. I experienced something that I've never experienced so far in motherhood. It was about 3 a.m, and I heard a blood-curdling scream. Now, as a mom, that is not something that you want to hear. It sounded like it was right next to my bed, but it was actually upstairs. And when I heard the scream, I leapt out of bed and I ran all the way up the stairs, lit only by the nightlight. And as I'm leaping these stairs, like 3 stairs at a time, I didn't even know I could do that. But there's all of a sudden this like adrenaline that took over, and I'm like, my kids, what's happening? Who's up there hurting them? When in reality, Justice, who's very tall, he's in the 99th percentile, decided to jump out of his crib for the first time in this new house. It was awesome. Now his crib lays flat on the floor, his mattress is literally on the floor, and he's still trying to figure out ways to climb out of it. Pray for us. He's not allowed to be out of the crib yet. But what this taught me is that night light, the most important light in my house, illuminated for me the path for where I needed to get in a moment of crisis. That in a moment of crisis, in a pitch black house, in a new environment, the very thing that I needed in that moment was that nightlight that showed me exactly where I needed to step in that moment of crisis. We are to operate as nightlights in a pitch black world, pointing people to Jesus so that when they find themselves in crisis, they know exactly where to go. Illuminating for people the exact direction they need to march when hard times come. Illuminating for people exactly where they need to race when difficulty comes. Because it's not a matter of if hard times come, it's a matter of when hard times come. We're to operate as those nightlights. But there's some things that make it difficult sometimes for us to make this choice. You see, right here on a Sunday, it's really easy for me to say, just make the choice, serve. Okay, Christina, I'll start serving. But inevitably, there's these things that kind of rise up within us that make it a little bit difficult to actually live this out. The first one is our attitude. I don't want to. We take on the attitude of a toddler. I just don't feel like it. Well, if you did everything you felt like it, you wouldn't do much of anything. And if you keep doing what you've always done, you're going to keep getting what you've always gotten. So what if 2021 looked a little bit different and you made a decision to begin serving? And that if 2020 has been void of serving, what if 2021 actually allowed for serving? See, I think too often we've shrunk down our lives, especially serving, to basically just our own personal interests. And if I'm not interested in it, I'm not going to do it. Thank God we didn't wait for Jesus to be interested in dying on a cross. Thank God we didn't wait until he had an interest or felt like it, but yet Jesus knew that he didn't come to be served, he came to serve. And as a result, he was compelled to go to the cross for you and me. And so often, we think of helping out in a kid's classroom as like hanging on a cross. Or going the distance for our neighbor, or helping out that coworker, or bringing up our neighbor's trash, or buying the person Starbucks in the line behind us. We act like we're being crucified in the process when reality is that's exactly what we were created and called to do, is to lay down our lives for the sake of others. It's a commandment that God gives every single one of us. It's how we have been made. And I think we could just start talking ourselves into it right now. Just saying, okay, you know what? January 10th is Growth Track. I'm going to sign up tonight. I'm going to get registered, and I'm going to see how God can use me in God's house. This week, I'm going to start taking an interest in what's happening in my coworker's life. This week, I'm going to start seeing how can I serve that friend who's going through a difficult time. This week, I'm going to start fill in the blank. What if this week we made a decision to begin going out of our way to start serving people around us? Another one, so we have our attitude. Another one is this thing. I hear this one all the time. I don't feel appreciated. I don't feel appreciated. You know what? We don't serve for the applause of man. We serve to honor our God. And I get wanting appreciation. I get that. But if I never received another thanks, the applause of my King is all I need. And we need to remove our desire for the applause of man, because that's not serving them, and it's certainly not serving us. And remove that desire, remove that need for the thanks and the applause of people, and instead focus on the applause of our King. What does he think? We concern ourselves far too much with what the person on our left and right thinks, and far too little on what God thinks. What if we reprioritized exactly what it was that God thought about us? So we have that attitude, we have that I don't feel appreciated. We also have the they don't deserve it. They don't deserve it. Well, if Jesus is our example, he died for all of us and none of us were qualified. And if none of us are qualified, then how are they not qualified of our service? And oftentimes I think the people that have hurt us the worst are the people that need to see Jesus the most. And what if, just what if, I laid aside my own need to be right, and I forsook that right to be right for them to be introduced to the righteousness of God? How much of a difference would that make in people's lives if I was willing to forsake that? Another one is, I don't have what it takes. I'm not gifted enough. I'm not talented enough. I don't know all the answers. I don't know if I'll be okay when I get into the situation. Well, let's start stepping out in faith and watch how God shows up. If we would just spend a little bit more time encouraging ourselves and talking to ourselves, a little less listening to ourselves, maybe God could actually start to use us. If we just built ourselves up and encouraged ourselves and started to see that when we just help with what we have, when we just give what we got, God can actually use that. Just what he got to us, can it get through us? Another one is, and the final one, there's too much to do. Too many needs, too many people, too much, that it becomes actually quite overwhelming. There's an actual psychological concept for this called the bystander effect. And what it does is it psychologically shuts us down. That when we see too many needs and too many people in a place of need, it causes us to become numb, and it causes us to push away, and it causes us to do nothing. There have been whole psychological studies that have been done on this, and that's why when a child is being kidnapped and no one else is doing something, people will keep walking by when nobody's doing anything because they think somebody else will step in and do something. What if you're that somebody? What if you are the person that God has placed in the exact moment and the exact time to be the help that that person needs? Rather than waiting for somebody else to take it upon themselves to do it, what if you're supposed to be the one to do it? What if today we made a decision to start allowing our lives to actually be used to impact other people? And I don't expect one of us to fix it all, but I do expect that if every single one of us just gave of what we have, just served with what time we are blessed with, we could actually change the world. I genuinely believe that. That if every single one of us allowed what God has gotten to us to get through us, we could genuinely change the world. I witnessed this last city group season as I saw women in my city group rally around a woman who communicated some very dire circumstances and a difficult time for her family. And as this woman opened up and as she shared, I watched as the other women in my group rallied around her. And one woman stepped out in faith I'm sure she had moments where she thought, someone else will step in. I'm sure she had moments where I can't solve all the need. I'm sure she had moments, I don't really want to do this. And yet she laid all of those attitudes aside, stepped out in faith and said, I'm going to allow what I have in my hands to be a help. And because she stepped out in faith, another woman stepped out in faith. And she said, I'm going to offer what I have. And another woman stepped out in faith and said, I'm going to offer what I have. And I watched as this entire city group rallied around this woman who was in dire need, in a desperate situation. And the need was met merely because people in my group said, I'm going to serve, I'm going to give, I'm going to help. Because as soon as I become aware of a need, I'm going to allow God to use me to help meet that need. And I watched as these women rallied around her, and her faith was encouraged, and her life was built up, and her life was changed as a result. I think back to so many conversations I've had with young people over the years who repeatedly say to me often about calling. And they talk oftentimes about calling and about what am I called to, and I don't know what I'm called to. And I always ask this when people talk to me about their calling. I say, where are you serving? Where are you serving? Because where we are serving is actually the setup for what we're called to do. Everything that I do now, I've learned from opportunities spent serving. As a professor, I learned how to be a college professor working for free as a TA, as a volunteer, as a teacher's assistant for years. I saw it up close and personal, and in serving in that capacity, I thought, I think I can do that. And now I just celebrated 13 years in higher education. In addition to that, I was leading a small group, a city group, in my city, and I saw that I actually can help people, and I think I could do this pastoring thing. I have a love for people. It was through serving as a volunteer in my church, leading a small group, that I discovered I could be a pastor. It was through helping people in a waiting room at a hospital that I discovered that in the darkest moments of people's lives, I could actually help as a therapist. I learned how to be a professor, a pastor, and a therapist, all from opportunities spent serving. So I ask people all the time, you don't know what you're called to? Where are you serving? It is through serving that God actually helps illuminate in our minds what we're gifted in, what He made us to do, how He created us. It's been incredible to watch in my life and in the lives of others. And we're made for more. We have to begin to understand that our lives matter for more than just us. People need us. Your coworkers need you. Your spouse needs you. Your family needs you. Everybody needs you. They're counting on you. And I understand all these attitudes, all these things, all these reasons why we don't want to serve. I get it. I'm at the front of the line. Trust me, the last place I want to be right now is up here. I hate speaking. I don't want to be up here. I'd rather be where you are. I'd honestly, like yesterday, Andrew and I got into 3 fights because I did not want to do this. And wouldn't you know, my husband just went above and beyond and served me all day. He took the kids to the park for 2 hours for me to message prep. He took the kids out for dinner so that I didn't have to worry about it. He just served me all day, and I was just mad. I get having attitude. I get not wanting to do it. But when we're called to do something, there is no excuse that is worth missing out. Because when we're obedient, God does miracles. When we're obedient, God opens doors. When we serve, God saves. When we serve people, we illuminate in people's lives the light and hope of Jesus. And there are too many people counting on us in order to miss out. The third thing is we have to own it. So we know our role, we make the choice. The third thing is we have to own it. In verse 28, it says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. See, Jesus owned every opportunity he was presented with to serve. His life was literally lived as one enormous act of service. His life was not for himself, but for us. His death was not for himself, but for us. His crucifixion was not for himself, but for us. His resurrection was not for himself, but for us. His ascension was not for himself, but for us. He did it all for us as selfless acts of service so that every step of the way we would know how loved we are by the maker of the heavens and the earth, going out of his way consistently so that we would know how loved we are. And in all of his omnipotence and all of his omniscience, God, deserving of all the honor, all the worthiness, all the praise, lowered himself and humbled himself as a slave, as a servant of all. And that is the example that we are to live by. I'm going to invite the team up, and I want to close with a couple thoughts. See, I've been saved for service and not just for status. That means that my title of Christian is actually a verb and not a noun. The status remains in infancy. The service is the mark of maturation and growth. One of the moments that I will never forget happened for me in Cambodia. And I was serving in Southeast Asia, and I was living there and working as an associate missionary with the Assemblies of God Church. And while I was living in Cambodia, I was about a month in, and I was still new to the country and learning the language. And how you got around in Cambodia was you rode on the back of these mopeds, and that's how you got from place to place. And I was riding on the back of a moped, and I told the driver where I wanted to go. And I had a very scary interaction. And I remember the moped driver stopping and another moped driver coming up and talking to this driver. And there was some kind of conversation, and the driver left, and I was left there, and I'm trying to talk. I'm like, come on, go, like, let's go. What's going on? Well, later I learned that when American women come, they try to get more fare than what was agreed upon. And so what they did was that driver went on to the missionaries where I was heading home to and demanded double the fare in order to bring me back. So I'm sitting on the back of this moped with this stranger in another country at 21 years old, which don't even get me started how my parents have so much faith to send me to the other side of the world. I'm imagining Justice and Adriana like at UF, and I'm like, no, God, 3 hours away, I can't do it. And my parents sent me halfway across the world, and I remember in that moment feeling so afraid and feeling so scared of what's going to happen, what's going on. And I was sitting on the back of the moped, and I was getting ready to jump off and run away because I was afraid. And the moped driver, sensing I was about to get up, lit up his moped and began driving fast in circles, so fast that I couldn't jump off the moped. And little did I know, the driver calls back, and then all of a sudden they bring me back to the missionary, and the missionary explains to me that this is something that they do, that you have to look for a certain license on certain mopeds to make sure you're getting on a safe one versus an unsafe one. I'm like, I wish you would have told me that when I got here a month ago, but okay. And I get there, and the missionary pays double the price, and I'm free, and I'm home, and I'm feeling good. Well, the next morning, I was struck by how much joy I had to serve at the children's home that day. I was working in an orphanage, and I was teaching English, and I was teaching dance and teaching Bible. And the fact that the night before I had had such a scary encounter, and the missionaries paid double the fare, paid my ransom, made me serve differently. All of us have had a ransom paid for our lives. Jesus talks about how he paid the price. He paid our ransom. Every single one of us. And I think we would serve differently if we thought more intently about how Jesus has rescued every single one of us. You see, I've been rescued to reach. I've been crowned to care. I've been helped to be a help. I've been saved to serve. But what am I doing to actually enact those things? How differently would my marriage look if I thought more about what I can give than what I can get? How differently would my workplace look if I thought, how can I help my coworker with their report this week rather than how can I look good to my boss? How differently would our friendships and our family look if we thought more about what we could give than what we could get? I've been up to my eyeballs this week in finals, which was part of why I was so frustrated yesterday with my husband. I have finals and I'm trying to preach. And I was looking at the report card of my students, and I began to translate it to us as followers of Jesus. That as I'm looking at my students' report cards, and they're graded on all of these assignments, and every assignment they have a letter grade for that makes up their ultimate grade. And I began to wonder, what if we had a heavenly report card? What if every single one of us was graded on these attributes and marks of maturation as followers of Christ? Forgiveness, what if I have an A? And joy, B+. Generosity, C+, but I'll do better in 2021. But what if I'm failing serving? Ultimately, all of those grades combined make up our letter grade. And I'm not saying God's in heaven with a ruler and he's grading you, but I am asking that if I were to give you a report card, how would you grade yourself today? What kind of grade would you have in the arena of serving? Because you are missing out on blessings, and so many people are missing out on the blessings that you have to offer the lives of so many. I really believe that serving would come so much more naturally if we just remembered how we've been served. One of the hardest times of serving for me came when I was serving at a children's hospital in the Seattle area. I worked in the waiting room of a cancer patient center for children. And I watched as week after week, different kids came in, and my sole job, my only purpose was to entertain and to serve the kids that were coming in who were waiting for treatment or who were waiting to see their doctor. And week after week, I'd serve in different capacities, playing games, reading stories, hanging out with kids. And there was this one little girl, a beautiful brown-haired, brown-eyed little girl. And I had such a connection with her. I just really loved her. And every time she'd come in, she'd yell, "Christina!" She'd come running up. And eventually, over the course of time, that beautiful brown hair began to fall out. And I watched as she shaved her head. And I watched as her mom shaved her head as a mark of solidarity. And I thought to myself so many times, what child in elementary school should be spending all of their free time at a clinic waiting for treatment? And it was such a joy to be able to spend that time. And I realized one day, gosh, I hadn't seen this little girl in weeks. And I asked the front desk lady, I said, "Where's so-and-so?" And she explained to me that that little girl had lost her fight with cancer and she had passed away. Well, some time went by and I got an email from the front desk lady and she said, "Hey, you remember that little girl you were asking about? Her parents asked about you." I said, "Really? What were they asking?" And the parents said, "Who's that woman that was always hanging out with our little girl?" And they said her name, and she was always filled with so much light and so much joy. And the woman said, "Oh, that's Christina. She goes to the college up the road, and she's a Christian. She goes to such and such church." And the mom wrote back, "We're not really into God. She's making us rethink it." A nightlight in the darkest of circumstances. And I share that story with you to encourage you that you may never see the ramifications of your service. You may never know the full effect of the impact that you have had on the life of another. It still makes it worth it. It all makes it worth it. Just as John shared earlier during the offering, some plant, some water, but God makes it grow. And every single one of us, when we play our part, when we allow what God's placed in our hands to get through us, every single one of us can work together collectively to make a difference. I've been saved for service, not just for status.